The thunderclap split the evening air as Elizabeth Zane clutched her father's shotgun to her chest, the rain beating down on the roof of her isolated homestead. 3 days alone in this remote corner of Wyoming territory, 1878, with nothing but the howling wind and distant wolf cries for company. Her pa was 6 days late returning from Cheyenne, and with each passing hour, the dread in her heart grew heavier than the storm clouds overhead. "They ain't coming back, Lizzie," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the rain hammering against the wooden shingles. "Nobody's coming for you now." At 22, Elizabeth had known hardship. After her mother succumbed to consumption 2 winters ago, it had been just her and Pa trying to make something of this stubborn land. Now, with the cattle spooked by the storm and Pa missing, she felt truly alone for the first time in her life. A sound outside made her freeze. Not the wind, not the rain. The distinct splash of hoofbeats in mud. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she moved to the window, peering through the curtain of water streaming down the glass. A figure on horseback approached through the downpour, tall in the saddle despite the weather's fury. Not her father's familiar silhouette. A stranger. Elizabeth positioned herself behind the door, shotgun raised. The floorboards of the porch creaked under heavy boots, followed by 3 solid knocks. "Hello? Anybody home?" A man's voice, deep but not threatening, called through the wood. Elizabeth remained silent, finger hovering near the trigger. "I found a man on the trail from Cheyenne," the voice continued. "Said his name was Thomas Zane. He's hurt bad. Asked me to check on his daughter." Her heart stopped. "Pa, is he alive?" she called out, voice cracking. "Yes, madam. Holed up at Doc Mitchell's in Sweetwater. I promised him I'd come. Said you might need help with the cattle during the storm." Elizabeth cracked open the door, keeping the shotgun visible. Through the gap, she saw a man in his late 20s, soaked to the bone, water dripping from the brim of his hat. His eyes were the color of whiskey in sunlight, and despite his drenched state, they held a steadiness that made her pause. "You rode all this way in this weather?" she asked suspiciously. The man nodded, water cascading from his hat. "Gave my word to your pa. And who might you be?" "Ethan Lawson, madam, cattle driver heading north to Montana." He glanced at the shotgun, then back to her face. "Your pa said you might be waiting for him, said you'd probably think no one would come." Elizabeth's grip on the shotgun loosened slightly. "And what did you tell him?" For the first time, a hint of a smile crossed the stranger's weather-beaten face. "I told him I did. I would come, that is." She studied him for a long moment, measuring the earnestness in those amber eyes against the wariness ingrained in her by frontier life. Finally, she stepped back, opening the door wider. "You'd better come in, Mr. Lawson, before you catch your death." Ethan stomped his boots on the porch and removed his hat before entering. Up close, Elizabeth could see he was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and a 3-day growth of beard shadowed his jaw. "Thank you, Miss Zane," he said, standing awkwardly just inside the door, conscious of the puddle forming beneath him. "Elizabeth," she corrected, lowering the shotgun but keeping it within reach. "What happened to my father?" Ethan's expression grew serious. "Horse spooked at a rattlesnake, threw him hard, broke his leg and a couple ribs. He was lucky I was riding that way. Found him about a day out from Cheyenne." Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, relief and worry battling within her. "But he'll recover?" Doc Mitchell seemed to think so. Said he needs at least 6 weeks off that leg, though. Ethan glanced around the modest cabin. "Your pa was mighty worried about you and the ranch. Said you had 40 head of cattle that needed moving to the high pasture before the creek floods." Elizabeth nodded. It was a job she couldn't manage alone, especially with the weather turning foul. The cattle would be trapped if the lower meadow flooded, and they could lose half their livelihood. "I'd planned to start moving them tomorrow," she admitted. "Pa was supposed to be back days ago." "Well," Ethan said, "I reckon that's why I'm here. I can help you move them first thing in the morning, if the rain lets up." Elizabeth studied him again. Helping a stranger meant delaying his own journey. "Why would you do that? You said you're headed to Montana." Ethan shrugged, his soaked shirt clinging to his shoulders. "A man's word is all he has out here. I told your father I'd see to it that you were all right." He hesitated. "Besides, My cattle drive doesn't leave for another 2 weeks. I was heading up early to visit my brother. The sincerity in his voice made something in Elizabeth's chest loosen, a knot of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. You must be freezing, she said abruptly, moving toward the stove. I've got stew keeping warm, and you're welcome to sleep in the barn tonight. Much obliged, Ethan replied, the gratitude evident in his voice. As Elizabeth ladled stew into a bowl, she watched Ethan from the corner of her eye. There was something reassuring about his presence, a steadiness that seemed to push back against the chaos of the storm outside. For the first time in days, she didn't feel quite so alone. The storm continued through the night, but by dawn, it had reduced to a gentle drizzle. Elizabeth rose early, years of ranch life having ingrained the habit deep in her bones. She was surprised to find the cabin empty, no sign of Ethan except for his neatly folded blanket by the fire. Stepping onto the porch, she saw him in the corral, already working with the horses. He had saddled her mare and was checking the hooves of her father's stallion. "You're up early," she called, walking toward him. Ethan looked up, a smile breaking across his face. In the morning light, Elizabeth could better appreciate his features, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled. "Didn't want to waste daylight," he replied. "Creek's rising fast. I checked it at first light. We need to move those cattle soon." Elizabeth nodded, impressed by his initiative. "I've got coffee on. We should eat something before we head out." Over a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee, they planned their day. Elizabeth knew these lands intimately, having worked them alongside her father since she was old enough to ride. "The herd's scattered in the south meadow," she explained. "We'll need to round them up first, then drive them along the ridge trail to the high pasture." Ethan listened attentively, asking questions about the terrain and the temperament of the cattle. His knowledge of ranching was evident, putting Elizabeth's remaining doubts to rest. "You've done this before," she observed. "Since I was a boy," he confirmed. "My pa had a small spread in Colorado, started driving cattle when I was 16. Been doing it ever since." "What happened to your pa's ranch?" Elizabeth asked, curious about this man who had appeared so suddenly in her life. A shadow crossed Ethan's face. "Lost it after the war. Pa never came home from Gettysburg, and Ma couldn't manage the taxes. My brother and I were too young to take over." He sipped his coffee. "That's why I'm heading to Montana. Emmett, my brother. He's got a claim up there. Says the land is good. Thought I might join him, start fresh." The simple honesty of his story touched Elizabeth. So many had lost everything during the war, and the years since had been cruel to those trying to rebuild. "I'm sorry about your pa," she said softly. Ethan nodded his thanks, then stood. "We should get moving. That rain's let up, but those clouds on the horizon don't look friendly." By mid-morning, they were in the saddle, working in tandem to gather the scattered cattle. Elizabeth was impressed by Ethan's skill. He handled his horse expertly, anticipating the movements of the cattle with practiced ease. "You're good at this," she called over the lowing of the herd. Ethan tipped his hat with a smile. "So are you. Not many women I know who can rope a steer that clean." Elizabeth felt a flush of pride at the compliment. Growing up as Thomas Zane's only child, she'd learned ranch work out of necessity, but she'd come to love the challenges of it, the sense of accomplishment that came from working the land. As they drove the herd toward the ridge trail, dark clouds gathered again on the horizon. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. "We need to move faster," Ethan called, concern etching his features. "That storm's coming in quick." They urged the cattle forward, but the animals grew increasingly agitated as thunder rumbled in the distance. Just as they reached the narrow part of the trail, a lightning bolt split the sky, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The lead steer bellowed in panic and veered off the trail. In an instant, the whole herd was in chaos, breaking formation and scattering in all directions. "Head them off!" Elizabeth shouted, spurring her mare toward the fleeing animals. Ethan reacted instantly, cutting across the path of several steers, forcing them back toward the trail. Elizabeth worked from the other side, her heart pounding as she maneuvered her horse between the panicked cattle and the steep drop at the edge of the ridge. Rain began to fall, quickly turning to a downpour that reduced visibility to mere yards. Elizabeth could barely see Ethan through the curtain of water, but she could hear his voice, steady and commanding as he worked to regain control of the herd. Suddenly, a young steer bolted directly toward the edge of the ridge. Without hesitation, Elizabeth raced after it, leaning low over her mare's neck. She was almost within reach when her horse hit a slick patch of mud and stumbled. Elizabeth felt herself being thrown forward. She hit the ground hard. The breath knocked from her lungs. Through the rain, she saw the steer stop at the edge, but her relief was short-lived as she realized her own momentum was carrying her toward the drop. Her fingers clawed at the muddy ground, searching for purchase, but everything was slick with rain. She felt herself sliding closer to the edge, panic rising in her throat. Then, strong hands grabbed her wrists. Through the rain, she saw Ethan, flat on his stomach, straining to hold her as the mud threatened to pull them both over. "I've got you," he gritted out, his grip like iron despite the rain. "Hold on to me." With a mighty effort, he pulled her back from the edge, inch by desperate inch. When she was far enough from danger, he wrapped an arm around her waist and dragged her completely to safety. They collapsed together on the muddy ground, gasping for breath. Elizabeth could feel Ethan's heart hammering against her back, as fast as her own. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. Elizabeth took stock of herself. Her right ankle throbbed, and she could feel scrapes on her hands and face, but nothing seemed broken. "I don't think so, just shaken up." Ethan helped her to her feet. But when she put weight on her ankle, pain shot up her leg. She would have fallen if not for his steady arm around her waist. "You can't ride like this," he said, frowning at the darkening sky. "And we can't stay here." The cattle had scattered completely now, spooked by the lightning and the commotion. Elizabeth felt despair well up inside her. If they lost the herd, they lost everything. "The cattle," she began. "We'll have to wait," Ethan interrupted firmly. "There's an old line shack about half a mile from here, if I remember your pa's directions. We need to get you there before this gets worse." Before she could protest, he lifted her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. With one arm securely around her waist, he guided the horse through the driving rain, leaving her mare to follow. The line shack was little more than a one-room shelter used by cowboys watching the herds, but right now it looked like a palace to Elizabeth. Ethan helped her inside and immediately set about building a fire in the small stone hearth. "Your ankle needs looking at," he said once the flames were crackling. Elizabeth sat on the room's only chair, suddenly aware of how soaked and muddy they both were. "It's just a sprain," she insisted, but allowed him to gently remove her boot. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he examined her swollen ankle. "Doesn't look broken," he agreed, "but you won't be riding for at least a day or two." The implications of this sank in. A day or two of delay could mean the difference between saving the herd and losing it all. "We don't have a day or two," she said, frustration evident in her voice. "If the creek floods—" "I'll go after the cattle at first light," Ethan interrupted. "Get them to the high pasture." Elizabeth stared at him. "By yourself? That's a two-person job at least." "I've handled bigger herds on my own," he said, with a confidence that wasn't boastful, just matter of fact. "Why?" Elizabeth asked after a moment. "Why are you doing all this for strangers?" Ethan busied himself wrapping her ankle with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. "Your pa did the same for me once," he said quietly. 3 years ago, I was driving a small herd through these parts, got caught in a blizzard, lost my bearings completely. Your father found me half frozen, brought me to your ranch." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Never forgot that kindness." Elizabeth remembered now. She'd been visiting her mother's sister in Denver that winter, had returned to hear her father's tale of a young cattle driver he'd rescued. "That was you?" Ethan nodded. "Thomas Zane saved my life. Least I can do is return the favor." The simple honesty in his words touched something deep in Elizabeth. In this harsh land, such connections were precious, the threads that bound people together against the wilderness. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small shack, a different kind of warmth began to grow. The storm continued through the night, the wind howling around the small shack like a living thing. Despite the circumstances, Elizabeth found herself oddly at peace. She and Ethan talked for hours by the fire, sharing stories of their lives. She told him about her mother's long illness, the struggle to maintain the ranch afterward. He spoke of his years on cattle drives, the characters he'd met, the vast landscapes he'd traversed. There was an easiness between them that surprised Elizabeth, as if they'd known each other far longer than a single day. "What will you do in Montana?" she asked as the fire burned low. Ethan poked at the embers, his face thoughtful in the fading light. "Build something that lasts, I hope. My brother started with 50 acres and a dozen cattle. Not much, but it's a beginning." "It's more than many have," Elizabeth observed. Ethan nodded. "What about you? Ever think of leaving this place?" The question caught her off guard. "Where would I go?" "Anywhere. Denver, San Francisco." He glanced at her. "You're young, educated from the way you speak. You could have a different life." Elizabeth considered this. The thought had crossed her mind, especially during the loneliest nights after her mother passed. But the ranch was more than just land to her. "This is my home," she said finally. "It's where my mother is buried. It's what my father has worked for his entire life. I can't just leave it." Ethan's eyes held a warmth that made her heart beat faster. "Loyal to your roots. I admire that." They fell silent, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. Elizabeth found herself studying Ethan's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. There was something compelling about him, a quiet strength that drew her in, despite her cautious nature. At dawn, the rain had finally stopped. Ethan rose early, checking on the horses and preparing to track down the scattered cattle. "I should be back by nightfall," he told Elizabeth, as she hobbled to the door to see him off. "Your ankle looks better, but don't push it." Elizabeth frowned, frustrated by her helplessness. "I don't like sending you out there alone." "I'll be fine," he assured her with a smile that made her stomach flutter. "Just have coffee waiting when I get back." She watched him ride away, a solitary figure against the pearl-gray dawn, and felt an unfamiliar tug of emotion. It had been just one day, she reminded herself. One day was not enough time to develop feelings for a stranger. Yet, as she turned back into the empty shack, she couldn't deny that Ethan Lawson had already become more than just a passing acquaintance. The day stretched endlessly for Elizabeth. She tended the fire, made a simple stew from the supplies stored in the shack, and tested her ankle periodically. By afternoon, she could put weight on it without wincing, though it still throbbed dully. As the sun began to set with no sign of Ethan, worry gnawed at her. Had he found the cattle? Was he lost? Injured? The land could be unforgiving, and a man alone faced countless dangers. When darkness fell completely, Elizabeth's anxiety peaked. She stoked the fire higher, hoping it might serve as a beacon if Ethan was trying to find his way back in the dark. It was well past midnight when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She grabbed her father's shotgun still habit despite everything and moved to the window. Relief flooded her when she recognized Ethan's silhouette in the moonlight. He dismounted slowly, his movements betraying exhaustion. Elizabeth threw open the door. "I was worried," she admitted as he climbed the steps. In the light spilling from the doorway, she could see he was covered in mud, a cut above his eyebrow crusted with dried blood, but his eyes were bright with triumph. "Got them," he said, the weariness in his voice overridden by satisfaction. "All 40 head, safe in the high pasture." Elizabeth stared at him in disbelief. "All of them? By yourself?" Ethan nodded, a tired smile spreading across his face. "Told you I would." Without thinking, Elizabeth threw her arms around him. She felt him stiffen in surprise, then relax, his arms coming around her waist. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "I don't know how to repay you." Ethan's hand gently touched her hair. "No need for repayment." "That's not why I did it." She pulled back slightly, suddenly aware of their proximity, of the warmth of his body against hers. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, standing in the doorway of a weather-beaten shack under a canopy of stars. Ethan broke the spell first, stepping back with a clearing of his throat. "Coffee still hot?" he asked, his voice rougher than before. "I'll heat it up," Elizabeth replied, turning toward the stove to hide the flush she could feel spreading across her cheeks. As Ethan washed up and Elizabeth prepared food for him, they fell into a comfortable silence. She noticed how he winced when he moved his right arm. "You're hurt," she observed, setting a bowl of stew before him. Ethan shrugged, then grimaced at the movement. "Took a fall chasing after a stubborn heifer, nothing serious." Elizabeth frowned. "Let me see." After a moment's hesitation, Ethan unbuttoned his shirt and slipped it off his right shoulder. An angry bruise was spreading across his upper arm and shoulder blade. Elizabeth gently probed the area, noting how he tensed under her touch. "Nothing seems broken, but you'll be sore for days." "Worth it," he said, meeting her eyes with a directness that made her breath catch. "Your cattle are safe. That's what matters." Later, as they sat before the fire, exhaustion finally caught up with Ethan. Elizabeth watched as he fought to keep his eyes open, his head nodding forward before he'd jerk upright again. "You should sleep," she said softly. Ethan blinked at her, his usual alertness dulled by fatigue. "I'll just rest my eyes a minute," he mumbled. Within moments he was asleep in the chair, his features softened in repose. Elizabeth watched him for a long while, this stranger who had ridden through a storm to help her, who had risked his life to save her cattle and her. In the flickering firelight, a realization dawned within her. She was falling for Ethan Lawson. The thought should have frightened her, but instead, it felt like coming home after a long journey. Gently, she covered him with a blanket, allowing her fingers to linger briefly on his shoulder. "Sleep well, Cowboy," she whispered. 2 days later, they rode back to the Zane ranch together. Elizabeth's ankle had improved enough for riding, and Ethan had checked the cattle one more time before they left the line shack. As they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Elizabeth felt a complex mix of emotions: relief at returning home, gratitude for Ethan's help, and a deep sadness knowing he would soon continue his journey to Montana. "Home at last," Ethan remarked, reining in his horse beside hers. Elizabeth nodded, taking in the familiar sight of the ranch house, the barn, the corrals. It looked unchanged, yet somehow everything felt different. "Will you stay the night?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Rest before you continue north?" Ethan studied her face for a moment. "If you're sure it's no trouble." "None at all," she assured him, perhaps too quickly. As they approached the ranch house, Elizabeth was startled to see smoke rising from the chimney. She exchanged a puzzled glance with Ethan. "Someone's there," she said, her hand moving instinctively to the rifle in her saddle holster. Ethan nodded, moving his horse slightly in front of hers as they approached. They were halfway to the house when the front door swung open. "Lizzie, thank the Lord!" Elizabeth's heart leaped at the familiar voice. "Pa?" Thomas Zane stood on the porch, one leg encased in a crude splint, supporting himself with a crutch under his arm. His weathered face broke into a wide smile. "Pa! What are you doing here?" Elizabeth exclaimed, dismounting and hurrying toward him, mindful of her own tender ankle. "You're supposed to be at Doc Mitchell's." "Couldn't stay put knowing you were out here alone during that storm," her father replied, embracing her with his free arm. "Doc patched me up enough to travel. Got a ride with the Wilkinsons yesterday." He looked over Elizabeth's shoulder at Ethan, who had dismounted and was standing a respectful distance away. "Lawson," Thomas Zane acknowledged with a nod. "You found her." "Yes, sir," Ethan replied. "Just like I promised." Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked between Ethan and his daughter. "And the cattle?" "Safe in the high pasture," Elizabeth told him. "Thanks to Ethan." Something in her tone made her father look at her more closely. A knowing expression crossed his face, but he simply nodded. "Then I'm doubly in your debt, Mr. Lawson. Come inside, both of you. Got coffee brewing." Inside, Elizabeth quickly set about preparing a proper meal, grateful for the familiar routine after the tumultuous days. As she worked, she could hear her father and Ethan talking in the main room, their voices a low, companionable rumble. When she brought out plates of food, she found them deep in conversation about cattle prices and grazing rights. It struck her how natural it seemed, Ethan sitting at their table, discussing ranching with her father as if he belonged there. Throughout the meal, she caught Ethan looking at her when he thought she wouldn't notice, his eyes warm with something more than simple friendliness. Each time their gazes met, she felt that same flutter in her stomach, that same catch in her breath. After dinner, Thomas excused himself, claiming his leg was paining him. "Lizzie, show Ethan to the guest room, will you?" he said, with a look that told Elizabeth he hadn't missed the current running between her and their visitor. Left alone with Ethan, Elizabeth suddenly felt shy. They stood in awkward silence for a moment. "Your father's a good man," Ethan finally said. Elizabeth nodded. "The best I know." She hesitated. When, when do you plan to continue to Montana? Ethan's eyes never left her face. I should leave tomorrow. My brother's expecting me. Of course, Elizabeth said, fighting to keep disappointment from her voice. I'll show you to the guest room. As they walked down the short hallway, Elizabeth was acutely aware of Ethan's presence behind her, of the subtle scent of leather and pine that seemed to surround him. At the guest room door, they paused. Elizabeth turned to wish him good night and found him standing closer than she'd expected. Elizabeth, he said softly, her name like a caress on his lips. These past few days... He trailed off, and Elizabeth found herself holding her breath, waiting. I've never met anyone quite like you, he continued after a moment. The way you handle yourself, your courage, your devotion to this land, and your father. Elizabeth felt her cheeks warm at his words. I'm nothing special, Ethan, just doing what needs doing. That's where you're wrong, he said, his voice low and earnest. You are special, more than you know. Their eyes held, and Elizabeth felt something shift between them, a barrier falling away. Slowly, giving her every chance to move away, Ethan leaned forward. His lips met hers in a kiss so gentle it was almost reverent. Elizabeth closed her eyes, her hands coming up to rest lightly on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they parted, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. I should go to Montana, he whispered. My brother's waiting. The land is waiting. Elizabeth nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. But I don't want to leave you, he confessed, the words seemingly pulled from somewhere deep within him. Then don't, she whispered back, surprised by her own boldness. At least, not yet. Ethan drew back slightly to look into her eyes. What are you saying? Elizabeth took a deep breath, gathering her courage. Stay, a few more days. Get to know me properly. Get to know this ranch. She hesitated. Then decide. A slow smile spread across Ethan's face, transforming his features in the dim hallway light. I'd like that, he said. I'd like that very much. He kissed her again, more firmly this time, his hands coming up to frame her face with a tenderness that made her heart ache. In that moment, Elizabeth knew with sudden clarity that whatever happened next, her life had changed irrevocably the moment Ethan Lawson knocked on her door during a storm. The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality for Elizabeth. Ethan's few days stretched into a week as he helped around the ranch, working alongside her to repair fences damaged in the storm, check on the cattle in the high pasture, and tend to the daily chores that her father's injury prevented him from handling. They worked well together, developing an easy rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Ethan seemed to anticipate her needs before she voiced them, passing her tools before she asked, lifting heavy loads she would have struggled with. Always there with a steady hand when her ankle troubled her. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset, paint the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson. Sometimes they talked for hours, sharing dreams and memories, discovering the countless small ways in which their lives and values aligned. Other times, they sat in comfortable silence, the space between them gradually shrinking night by night, until Elizabeth found herself leaning against Ethan's shoulder, his arm around her waist, her head tucked perfectly beneath his chin. Thomas Zane watched their growing closeness with a knowing eye, but said nothing, though Elizabeth often caught him hiding a smile behind his coffee cup when Ethan's hand would linger on hers at the breakfast table. On the 8th day, as they rode back from checking the northern fence line, Ethan reined in his horse atop a rise overlooking the ranch. Elizabeth stopped beside him, following his gaze across the rolling landscape. Beautiful country, he remarked, his eyes taking in the distant mountains, the winding creek, the patchwork of meadows. It is, she agreed. Harsh sometimes, but beautiful. Ethan turned to look at her, his expression serious. I have to leave tomorrow, Elizabeth. My brother's been expecting me for weeks now. Though she had known this moment was coming, the words still felt like a physical blow. Elizabeth nodded, not trusting herself to speak. But I've been thinking, Ethan continued, his eyes never leaving her face. Montana's a fair piece from Wyoming. Letters take weeks. Visits would be few and far between. Yes, Elizabeth managed, her throat tight with unshed tears. So, I've come to a decision. Ethan reached across the space between their horses and took her hand in his. "I'm not going to Montana." Elizabeth stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What?" "I'm writing to Emmett tonight, telling him I've found something here in Wyoming that I can't leave behind." His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "If you'll have me, that is." "Ethan," Elizabeth whispered, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he must hear it. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you, Elizabeth Zane. I've known it since that night in the line shack, watching you sleep by the fire, so strong and yet so vulnerable." His voice was steady, sure. "I'm saying I want to stay. To build a life here with you and your father, to help make this ranch thrive." Tears spilled down Elizabeth's cheeks, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling like they'd been waiting a lifetime to be spoken. "I think I started falling for you the moment you showed up at my door in that storm." Ethan's smile was like sunrise breaking across his face. He urged his horse closer, leaning across to kiss her, his hand gentle against her cheek. "There's one more thing," he said when they parted, suddenly looking nervous. "It's rather soon, I know, but—" He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "This was my mother's. I've carried it with me since she passed, waiting for the right woman to give it to." Elizabeth's breath caught as Ethan held the ring between them. "Elizabeth Zane, will you marry me, be my partner in life, in this ranch, in everything that comes?" For a moment, Elizabeth couldn't speak past the emotion welling in her throat. Then she nodded, the movement sending fresh tears coursing down her cheeks. "Yes," she managed finally. "Yes, Ethan Lawson, I will marry you." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as if it had been made for her. Then he kissed her again, a kiss full of promise and future and home. As they rode back to the ranch together, the setting sun gilding the landscape around them, Elizabeth felt a certainty settle in her heart. When the storm had raged and she had thought no one would come, Ethan had said, "I did." And in doing so, he had not only saved her cattle and her livelihood, he had given her a love she had never dared to hope for. Thomas Zane took the news of their engagement with a broad smile and suspiciously bright eyes. "About time you asked her," he told Ethan, clapping him on the shoulder. "Been watching you two circle each other like cautious wolves for days." That night, the three of them sat on the porch long after sunset, making plans for the future. Thomas suggested building a second cabin on the eastern part of the property for the newlyweds, but Ethan demurred. "No need to rush that," he said, his hand warm around Elizabeth's. "This house has room enough for all of us, at least until your leg is fully healed, sir. After that, we can discuss expanding." Elizabeth leaned against Ethan's shoulder, contentment washing through her. It seemed impossible that just 2 weeks ago she had been alone and afraid, certain that help would never come. Now, her future stretched before her, bright with possibility and love. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, a simple ceremony in the Sweetwater Church with half the county in attendance. Elizabeth wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered by Mrs. Patterson, the blacksmith's wife. Ethan stood tall in a new suit, his eyes never leaving Elizabeth's face as they spoke their vows. Thomas Zane, finally free of his splint, but still walking with a cane, proudly gave his daughter away, whispering to Ethan as he placed Elizabeth's hand in his, "You'd better take good care of my girl, Lawson." "Every day of my life, sir," Ethan promised solemnly. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with food and dancing and toasts to the happy couple. As the evening wore on, Elizabeth and Ethan slipped away from the gathering, walking hand in hand under a canopy of stars. "Happy, Mrs. Lawson?" Ethan asked, drawing her close. Elizabeth smiled up at her husband, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied truthfully. Ethan's kiss was tender, a promise of all the days and nights to come. "When your father told me about his daughter alone at that ranch," he murmured against her hair, "something told me I needed to be the one to go, like I was meant to find you." "And I was meant to find you," Elizabeth replied, thinking of all the chance occurrences that had brought them together, her father's accident, the storm, the scattered cattle. "Even when I thought no one would come." Ethan's arms tightened around her. "I will always come for you, Elizabeth, always." 5 years later. Elizabeth stood on the porch of the expanded ranch house, watching as Ethan taught their 3-year-old son Thomas to ride his first pony. The little boy's delighted laughter carried across the yard, mingling with the sounds of the ranch in full operations, cattle lowing in the distance, ranch hands calling to each other, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer from the new forge Ethan had built last spring. The Lawson-Zane ranch had flourished under their combined care. What had once been 40 head of cattle was now over 200, with prime grazing land extending across 3 valleys. They employed 6 ranch hands full-time, and their beef commanded top prices at market. Elizabeth's hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, where their second child grew. She smiled as she saw her father emerge from the barn, his limp barely noticeable now, except on the coldest days. He made his way toward little Thomas, who immediately demanded, "Grandpa, watch me ride!" Thomas Zane had moved into the new cabin, built just 100 yards from the main house after Elizabeth and Ethan's first anniversary, insisting the newlyweds needed their privacy. But he remained an integral part of the ranch operations and family life, his experience and wisdom guiding them through each season. "Careful with him, Ethan," her father called as the pony trotted in a small circle. "He's precious cargo." "Got him secure, Thomas," Ethan assured him, one hand firmly on his son's back. "He's a natural, just like his mother." Elizabeth's heart swelled with love as she watched the 3 generations of her family together. When Ethan looked up and caught her eye, his smile still sent the same thrill through her that it had the first time she'd seen it. Later that night, with little Thomas asleep and the ranch quiet under a blanket of stars, Elizabeth and Ethan sat on the porch swing, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. "I got a letter from Emmett today," Ethan said, his voice soft in the darkness. "He's finally getting married next spring, wants us to come up for the wedding." Elizabeth smiled. Ethan's brother had visited twice over the years, and they had grown fond of the quiet, thoughtful man so similar to Ethan in many ways. "We should go," she agreed. "It would be nice to see Montana." Ethan's hand moved to cover hers, where it rested on her growing belly. "Think you'll be up for the journey with a new baby?" "We'll manage," Elizabeth said confidently. "This family can handle anything together." Ethan pressed a kiss to her temple. "Do you ever wonder how different our lives might have been if I hadn't found your father on that trail? If I had kept riding to Montana as planned?" Elizabeth considered this. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I think it wouldn't have mattered. Somehow, some way, we would have found each other eventually." "You think so?" Ethan asked, a smile in his voice. "I know so," Elizabeth replied with certainty. "Some things are just meant to be." Ethan turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "Like a stubborn young woman and an equally stubborn cowboy?" "Exactly like that," Elizabeth laughed softly, leaning in to kiss him. As their lips met, sweet and familiar, yet still thrilling after all these years, Elizabeth silently thanked that long-ago storm that had brought Ethan Lawson to her door. In her darkest hour, when she had thought no one would come, he had said, "I did." And in doing so, he had given her not just assistance or even love, but a life richer and more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. Together they had built something that would endure long after they were gone, a legacy of love, strength, and devotion that would pass down through generations. And it had all begun with a promise kept, with one man's determination to reach a lonely ranch in the midst of a Wyoming storm. As they sat wrapped in each other's arms under the vast Wyoming sky, their past behind them and their future stretching bright before them, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that they had found in each other the greatest treasure the frontier could offer, a love as enduring as the land itself,